All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. My name's Nick, and I work for Omniplex Learning. And we're going to talk today about learning in the flow of work, and how can you make that a reality for your workforce. So, a little bit about me. I'm the digital transformation specialist here at Omniplex. And I came into the business through the acquisition of a previous company that I was working at called Nickled. Nickled is a digital adoption specialist as well. So I joined Omniplex in March of this year through the acquisition. But before that, I've been working at Accenture and a few other places on digital transformation projects. So I have a long history of this, and it's seeing how digital transformation projects go well and how sometimes they don't go so well. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is the learning landscape that we find ourselves in, and then also the practicalities of setting up learning in the flow of work in a way that it can work for your users. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some quick wins right at the end, so please stay, and we'll see how we go. All right. So at Omniplex Learning, this is our mission: to enable individuals and organizations to reach their full potential through learning. And I was thinking about this, and if you think about it, we've been around for 30 plus years, and so our mission landscape has changed incredibly over that time. So this is what learning through a computer looked like in the 1990s. Is anyone old enough here to remember Encarta, those CDs that you put in a, yeah? Okay, good, a few, good, not just me. So, we all learned it through Encarta in the 1990s, and then in the 2000s, we had the growth of the internet, and you had these really basic forms that you could kind of input data into. And then in the 2010s, things became kind of a bit more interactive and a bit more online, and we could use the web for the first time. And it was in this period that we really saw solutions like Articulate and Docebo begin to take off and kind of go more mainstream. And then, that took us through the teen years. And in 2019, everything changed again. And I think, all of us as L&D practitioners found ourselves doing things that really we never expected to have to do. So being asked to train somebody who's day one on their job, and being asked to train them from home, teach them how to do a bunch of stuff that they've never seen before, but you actually have no face-to-face contact with them. That's a really difficult thing to do. And so I think it began to change all of the way that all of us think about L&D and the way that we can do training. So our mission landscape has changed through those years. And something else really interesting is happening. So business operations, the way that all of us do business, have also transformed incredibly over the last couple of years. So this parallel underlying trend that you have from the 90s through to today is that you've had this explosive growth in cloud software. So this chart actually shows the size of public cloud software as a service, the market from 2008 to 2020. And just look at this growth curve and think about what this means for L&D professionals. 10 years ago, training somebody on systems just wasn't really a thing. Nowadays, it's a core part of what we have to do as L&D professionals. It's a massive part of the training that we need to deliver. And that means, actually, expectations are higher than ever. Because if you think about it from the point of view of a user, of a learner of one of these systems, we're asking them to come into work, we're asking them to use the tools that we want them to use, we're asking them to get it right, so they've got to get that data accuracy correct, otherwise we can't run our business. And we're asking them often to do it by themselves. They have to come in and do the work without any help a lot of the time. But their expectations of us in L&D are equally high. So, they need to be onboarded, they need to be taught how to do stuff, and they need to be supported when they need support. And that's a big ask, I think. So expectations, it's no wonder that all of us are feeling a bit of pressure. And the sad thing is that actually a lot of employees are feeling quite underwhelmed. So the indications are people are pretty underwhelmed by the way that they're interacting with technologies. So this stat is from Qualtrics, right? And they do an annual employee experience trends report. And only 1 in 3 people say that their experience with company technology exceeds their expectation. So for 70% of people, we're kind of either just meeting their tech expectations or we're falling below the line, right? So we're failing our users a little bit. And what happens? This causes a lot of stress. So this stat's actually from Microsoft. And Microsoft, they do a work trend index. And basically they polled for this edition frontline employees. But it would surprise me if it wasn't the case for everybody. And basically, 46% of people said that they could use better technology to make their job easier, and that would reduce the level of stress. And what really struck me about this figure was that this was the third most quoted thing, right? The first most quoted thing that they wanted was a pay rise. The second most quoted thing was more time off. As L&D professionals, we can't really do much about those two things. But this thing, we can really help with. And so it really stuck with me. And this really matters. So in a hybrid world, this quote is from Harvard Business Review. In a hybrid world, an employee's tech experience defines their experience working for the company. We need to think about that. And actually, if you think about the costs of getting it wrong, they're immense. So we have additional costs by not getting this right. There's a time implication as well. People take a long time to do things. That has a real knock-on on our productivity. That, in turn, has an implication for our revenue. We make less money doing the same amount of work. And of course, then it hits morale. And morale is arguably the most serious point here. Because if people get frustrated with your company technology, if you don't give them the tools to learn to use these systems in the right way, they're just going to leave. And that's a real issue. To make this presentation, I went through Glassdoor. And so I was just Googling Glassdoors for how many people had said, I left my company because the technology was rubbish. And it was quite a lot. So it's something to be aware of. I think there are some hard truths that we need to consider here, though. So we know that the experience isn't great. We're failing sometimes. But I think for a lot of us, in enterprise software, most learners are actually never going to reach the top of the learning curve. So everyone's going to be familiar with this graph, proficiency and experience. And the idea is that as you do something more, your proficiency at it kind of goes up, right? And obviously, in an ideal world, you want learners to be right at the top. They should be experts in their systems. But realistically, in enterprise software, an expert is quite a big thing to ask for. So for the tools that we use every day, most people are going to cap out about here. And there's not all that much that we can do about it. Software changes, roles change, so generally people kind of give up about halfway. And I bet everybody knows the feeling of you think you've mastered something, and then it completely changes, and the software looks completely different, and it's really frustrating. Of course, ideally, we want our software to look like this, right? The software that we use every day, it should look like Instagram. Anybody could use this. It's so simple. And with something like Instagram, you have a really steep learning curve. So steep learning curve, often people think it's a bad thing. In this case, it's not really, because you get proficient really quickly. Unfortunately, and this is bad news, they don't exist. So realistically, most enterprise software that we use, it looks a bit like this. It's really hard work. And that's probably for a good reason, right? The apps that most of our businesses run on, the software that we rely on to do our day-to-day business functions, they're necessarily complicated. We use these to run multi-million, multi-billion-dollar businesses. So of course they're going to be a little bit complex. Maybe not this complex, but pretty complex. And we're kidding ourselves if we expect that, we can boil them down to something that looks like Instagram. That said, we have to be mindful of this. And I think this quote, again from HBR, encapsulates it really well. So for learning to really happen, it must fit around and align itself to working days and working lives. We need to fit with our users and to make it easy for them so that they can do their jobs and learn at the same time. And that brings me on to learning in the flow of work. So this was popularized by Josh Bersin in 2018, which is where this graph comes from. And I think this graph is quite nice because it shows that over the last 20 years, we've been on something of a journey. And all credit to Josh here, but you can think of this as 4 evolutions of training. So, we had the LMS days where people log on, they could pick the training that they wanted, and then they could just do the training. And then in 2005, you had kind of more of a talent management approach, where you had more learning paths and like a career track that people could follow. And then as we went into the 2010s and through the teens, we went into this kind of continuous learning path where we could do more things with video, we could kind of embed it into applications, and the LMS became more of an experience platform. And then through the course of the pandemic, we moved into digital learning. And I think, we're kind of here about now. We've got micro-learning, we've got courses everywhere, we've got real-time video, and basically we're at this point where we can embed a lot of our content directly into the learner's flow of work. This is super cool. It's a really exciting time to be in L&D, and there are huge benefits to it. So learning in the flow of work drives productivity, because you're not expecting people to jump out of applications and to go and do something different. It actually increases engagement as well with formal learning. So people are more likely to turn up to formal learning courses, to the classroom sessions that you put on. If you can teach them the boring stuff, the functional stuff, in their flow of work, it allows people to get excited about learning again, which is really, really cool. And then finally, it improves knowledge retention. And I often stop to think that, we put people in a classroom and we teach them how to use something like Salesforce. And then in 3 months, we're like, oh, do you remember how to do that in Salesforce? And of course, nobody remembers, because it was a day-long session where you taught them tons of things, and we're expecting them to remember this one really small point. And I think it's just not realistic. So we can really improve knowledge retention with learning in the flow of work. That's my brief pitch. I hope everyone agrees that this sounds super cool. Let's talk about how we would get started, how we can begin to make this a reality. And there are a few things to think about here. I think the first is, as L&D professionals, what role can we play? And I really see it as L&D being more of a hub role. So as L&D, we're going to bring together all of these thoughts and perspectives from different parts of the organization. So if you think of like business operations, they're going to know where there are kind of systematic failures where learning in the flow of work might be able to help. So I had a conversation with someone at Omniplex the other day who was in the finance team, and he was tearing his hair out because he couldn't get sales to fill out these forms properly. And that's a brilliant opportunity for learning in the flow of work, right? Instead of all this backwards and forwards, we could just put something in the right place to teach people how to fill out a form properly, and this guy's life immediately improves. Josh isn't here, but I'm sure he would say thank you if he was. System owners are the next ones. So system owners are often the ones who are answering the questions about the key systems that you're using in the business. So they might be your Salesforce admin who gets, 20 times a week, someone emails them and says, how do I reset my password? That's painful, right? And by asking them how to overcome this, we can actually begin to pull out more knowledge from the organization. And finally, these informal support channels are really important too. So just asking people who you know are the SMEs inside your business, where can we improve this? What can we do to make this easier for our users, for our learners? Is a really good way to get feedback. And as L&D, we can then kind of bring all of that together and start to think about how we're going to plan this approach of learning in the flow of work. And then I can introduce my virtuous cycle. And it's virtuous because it gets better over time. And we're going to dive in and just examine each of the different phases. And I can give you some practical suggestions of things that you might want to do to begin rolling this out inside your company. So we're going to start with understanding. And we talked about this in a previous webinar, if anybody attended. We started to think about 3 things. Essentially, you want to think about processes, you want to think about usage, and you want to think about users to understand the scale of your problems. So processes. Here you're going to want to identify which of the business processes are most important to the company, right? And you'll need to gather on some data on how things are working inside the business. So my suggestion here is basically that you perform an audit. So you can perform an audit of systems usage across all of your kind of highest impact business workflows. So think of, you have a sales team, maybe it's 20 people, they each log into their sales system 20 times a day. That's a tremendous amount of usage of a system, right? And so you can begin to gather that data on how the software is used, and that's going to give you an idea of where to start with this. Next up, you're going to want to ask people about usage, and this is going to help you identify some of the red flags where you can see that digital adoption can actually be improved. So ask people really specific questions about all of the software apps that they're using on a day-to-day basis. So ask them questions like, are people using them universally? How many carve-outs are there? How many times a day does someone go to do something in a system and then give up and decide that they don't want to do it and they want to do something else instead? Are the outputs as expected? Garbage in, garbage out. If you know that one of your systems is not working as well as it should be, that's a pretty good indication that you can do some more training. And then finally, is the data that you're capturing accurate? So this is going to help you to find those red flags in terms of systems usage. And then finally, we want to be people, right? So we want to ask the people behind the platform how they find it. What software are our employees or our learners scared of? What are they raising support tickets for? This is a really, really good thing as well. If you have a centralized ticketing system for support, just look, what's the balance of tickets in that system? And you'll probably find that there's some systems which cause a huge issue. What systems do they hate using? You ask anyone inside an organization, what do you hate using every day? They're going to tell you. People really, they suffer in silence until they can't take it anymore. And so you'll often get some quite comical but very insightful answers to this question. And finally, where aren't they following processes and why aren't they doing it? So again, back to those carve-outs, but you want to ask people why they're not following processes. So that's our first stage, the understanding stage. And with this, you should be pretty well equipped. So you're going to understand the processes, the systems, and the people. And then after that, you can begin to actually design a learning in the flow of work program. What might that look like? Well, you want to consider, and then you want to create. And I think it's tempting when you work in L&D to start with a really big training needs analysis, to spend weeks and weeks trying to figure out what you want to train people. And I would argue that if you followed the advice in the understanding section, actually you might not need to do that. So you should already have some quick wins, and implementation of learning in the flow of work can actually be much lower effort than other forms of L&D. You can often do things quite quickly and then be more agile in the way that you respond to feedback and stuff. So if it's just a case of making some of your existing resources available, that's a really quick win. So first of all, identify your training needs, but don't spend weeks on it. Do it quickly. Second of all, identify the processes and the roles. There's no doubt that there are some processes and roles that are more suited for learning in the flow of work than others. So, for instance, like I said, if you have repetitive tasks that you know lots of people do, that's an ideal candidate. And you want to think about starting there because you know that it's going to have the highest business impact when you look at the numbers. Next up, you can think about mapping delivery methods. So for instance, you want to think about how you can make this training really accessible. So how can you roll it out to as many users as possible? Can you offer it on demand? Put it in front of people when they need it? And then can you be intelligent about it? So one of the coolest things about systems like Omniplex Guide, which I work in and I'll talk about a bit later, is we can actually be really smart about where we show training to users. They should see it when they're in the place where they need to see it. So that's what I mean about being intelligent with the delivery methods. And finally, you can plan content creation. And that's probably worthy of a whole other talk. But basically, you want to start with A to Z, but you really only need to get to point B, right? The rest of the alphabet can wait. Just start with your content creation with the smallest possible wins and build from there. So that's design. Next up, we want to deploy it. So deployment varies hugely, and it really depends on what kind of a learning in the flow of work system you want to set up. In digital adoption, which is where I work, we typically work to a 30-day onboarding process, right? So from the point where you buy Omniplex Guide, we work with you for 30 days to get it set up, and then we go live. Now, a more bespoke system, that's going to take longer. Something that you buy off the shelf, it might be even faster than that. So generally, it's hugely variable, but I would still have two key pieces of advice. First, implement in phases. So realistically, the best learnings that you're going to get are from the first users who use this system. So start small. Start with a pilot group. Give it to a few people in the company and allow them to try learning in the flow of work for the first time. Gather their feedback and then improve. And the next thing is, we've kind of already touched on this, but think about how learning in the flow of work fits into your broader curriculum. So that 10% structured training element should be the tentpole, and then learning in the flow of work kind of cascades around it. And it can be doubly important when those two things work in tandem. You can get people really excited about that tentpole training, that broader curriculum that you're offering, and then you can kind of dive into their lives and offer learning in the flow of work as a really simple thing to allow them to do their day jobs. And considering the broader important the broader curriculum is important because we want to be enriching our people's lives, right? We want to be offering them things that they couldn't do before, helping them to learn new things. And you're not going to be able to do that with only learning in the flow of work, and you're not going to be able to do it with only structured training. So it needs to be a blend. And then finally, we want to talk about refining. This completes our virtuous cycle. Refining is arguably the most exciting part of this because it's real time. So often with course creation, what we end up doing is we design a course, we deliver it, and then we forget about it. We might not use it ever again. But if you capture the right data, learning in the flow of work can really, really get better over time, and it kind of completes this virtuous cycle. You can track data in such insightful ways if you're capturing the right thing. So how are learners responding? Are they opening or viewing the resources that you're providing for them? Many tools are going to give you really powerful analytics. Are they using it in the right way? Are they just clicking through? Is your drop-off rate really high at certain points? All of this stuff we can calculate and capture with learning in the flow of work tools, which is awesome. And then finally, you want to evaluate and adjust. So think about what you've learned from that pilot phase, from that secondary phase. Go back and make tweaks over time. That's basically how learning in the flow of work can be rolled out simply inside a business. And you'll notice that I haven't really mentioned tools so far. And that's because there are tons of different ways that you can do this, and they're all kind of equally valuable. But I want to give you some kind of quick wins for next steps. So things that you can think about doing when you leave here today and you go home. So the first thing that you should do, obviously, is come and see Omniplex Guide. Our stand is just here. And I just wanted to show you how this might look inside an organization. So this is the product that I work on, Omniplex Guide, and we bill it as offering real-time help for employees using software whenever they need it. And that's a bit kind of abstract, so we can boil it down to some really simple things. We'll start in the middle with in-app guidance. So this is how Omniplex Guide looks on a system like Microsoft Dynamics. Basically, it's in-app guidance. It puts a layer over Dynamics, and it allows you to point at stuff and tell the learner what they have to do at the right time. We can also do things like embedded video content. So this comes back to what I was saying about making the most of the content that you've got. You can basically embed the video content inside the tool so that when the user logs into Salesforce for the first time, they've got the Salesforce video that you've beautifully created already and put on the LMS, but they're going to have it right inside the CRM system. And then finally, Omniplex Guide offers this browser extension, so the user can actually click for help at any time and can actually see a slide out with all of the guidance that's specifically for that page. And then they can click through and complete a curriculum without leaving the app. So it's pretty cool. Come and see it. I'll be happy to show you how it works. Number 2, find your low-hanging fruit. So this is quite a fun one to think about. You really want to be incentivizing company experts to share the knowledge that they have. Often we think that as L&D developers, we have to take the time and actually build everything ourselves. But people are normally really happy to share their expertise, especially if you've got SMEs who are already using systems. So they can do it in really creative ways nowadays as well. So you have people they'll create smartphone videos, they'll happily blog for you, they'll create GIFs, all of this stuff. They can build guides inside Omniplex Guides, and you can offer prizes for the most creative content or the most helpful content, and then you can take that content and deliver it out to your users without having to engineer anything for yourself. You can also ask systems owners if their systems can integrate with the learning and the flow of work. So often you'll find that people think that you need specialized tools to do this, and sometimes you do, and sometimes they can help. But often you'll find that with a tool like Salesforce, you can edit templates. You can link to content without even needing to buy additional applications. You can actually just do it yourself. So it's a really quick way. So your systems owners should know if their applications can be customized in order to deliver some small bits of learning in the flow of work content. And that's a really quick way to implement this and to capture that low-hanging fruit. The next thing is use the content and the channels that you've got. So start to think about all of those poorly structured learning portals that you may have kicking around. Think about all of those PDF files that you've created and think about how you can chunk them, cut them up, put them in the right place, deliver them to users when they need them. And that's a really quick way to quickly find success in this without having to do much real work. And then finally, find out who's suffering silently. And this is this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Ask for a usage report on those top systems, and often you'll find that the 80-20 rule probably applies here. So you'll find that actually it's 20% of your systems that give you 80% of learning difficulties inside the organization. So by asking people, you're more likely to uncover that information, and you're more likely to be able to design an effective learning in the flow of work program. The final thing that I would recommend is if you have like a pulse check-in where you check in with all of your teams every month or every week, just ask a systems usage question. It's probably not something that you've ever done before, but just ask people what they're frustrated with. You'll often get really insightful answers, and it's well worth doing. And that's pretty much it. So that was a whistle-stop tour of learning in the flow of work, but I do hope that it was helpful. Come and talk to us. We'd be very happy to talk more about this. But for now, I'll leave it there, and I hope that you enjoyed the session.